The U.S. and Rising Powers, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. When George Bush took office in January of 2001, political scientists were contemplating a unipolar world in which the U.S. enjoyed unrivaled hegemony. 8 years later, Barack Obama faces a vastly different political landscape. As other nations join the U.S. in the top tier of the global order, American policymakers must find the balance between competition and cooperation. To help us explore the new geopolitical environment facing the new Obama administration, we're joined by Michael Kraig, Director of Policy Analysis and Dialogue at the nonpartisan Stanley Foundation. The foundation focuses primarily on peace and security issues and advocates for principled multilateralism. Dr. Kraig manages the overall direction of several initiatives designed to widen policy debate in the United States and abroad. Michael Kraig, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to first quiz you on your response to a couple reactions to this whole issue of rising powers and what it means for the United States. And the first one I want to test your reaction to is this sort of maybe a minimalist kind of reaction, which is to say, oh, rising powers, we've heard this before. You know, Japan was supposed to take over the world, and Taiwan, the new tigers, and that didn't happen. So this is just going to go the way of that. If you don't subscribe to that minimalist position, why not? Or if do you, and if not, why not?
Well, I think what happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when people suddenly saw, wow, there's a really strong Germany, there's a really strong Japan, is they looked backwards. And if you look backwards in history over the last, say, 500 years since great powers first started in what we now know as Western Europe, the pattern is if you're a great state, you're a great military state. And you're somewhat aggressive and competitive, zero-sum in behavior, trying to expand your territory or your gold holdings or whatever vis-a-vis someone else. And it turned out that looking backwards didn't help us very much. In the 90s and the early 2000s has made that very clear that, in fact, in part because of American leadership in building a qualitatively new world order after World War II, based on economic interdependence and trade and so forth, being a great power no longer means that you're automatically going to spend double digits on the military in terms of percentage of your GNP. You're going to start being more bellicose in your foreign policy. And in fact, that didn't happen with South Korea and Japan. And even to a great degree, it hasn't happened with China.
So in that sense, I mean, maybe Japan has become a great power, but not the great power we expected they would be.
Exactly.
Based on those military metrics and sort of the domination that we would expect from another country.
Exactly. I remember reading all those articles in Foreign Affairs, the pro and the con. Japan is going to take over Asian security in both good and bad ways, or China is, or they're both going to fight with each other. And while there are tensions caused by the rise of powers in regions throughout the world, it's inevitable. It's not the same as the tensions in past hundreds of years when great power meant a certain thing. It meant pretty constant warfare and large army and fairly competitive behavior with all the neighbors and others around the world. And that competition now is most of the time in the economic realm. Doesn't mean there's no competition, but the people who were expecting in the 90s that there'd be a rise of a specifically military power, military-focused power, simply hasn't come to pass.
So it kind of segues into this what I want to test you on. The second thing I want to test you on, which is sort of a maximalist or maybe an overreaction to the rising power notion, which is to say, hey, the sky is falling. We have invested our funds and our treasure and our people into war fighting, and especially in the last 8 years, we've fallen behind hopelessly in the economic sphere. We're losing credibility politically and in other ways that we've basically been overtaken by events, that rising powers have gone past us. And so we're in for a very long, difficult next 2-3 decades.
Right. Well, I think there's some real truth to that, but sometimes I wonder if it has less to do with the relative rise of others than the relative fall of ourselves through a lot of our own policies. And what I mean by that is, for instance, is China using its economic power, or at this point even Saudi Arabia with all those so-called petrodollars that they're holding on to, are they using it in ways that subvert our values or build up military again or compete in some way that would threaten our identity or our territory? No. But what is happening is, very simply, we're losing market share. We're losing jobs. We're losing skilled jobs, high-end jobs. Part of this is globalization, but part of it is policies that have encouraged dollars to fly abroad. But also, as you said, incredible spending on the military side within our own budget, while other nations are focusing more on things like infrastructure and education, including the sciences. And it's almost like the U.S. has sort of lost the ABCs of domestic policy as well as international. And so I think the maximalist position is right in a sense. There is real reason for concern, but is it because these rising powers will use their power in negative ways towards us, twisting our arm, forcing us into things, or is it because our own policies are undermining us? And I favor more the latter view.
Well, I guess we mentioned in the intro the idea that 8 years ago people talked about this being the American century. That it was going to be the U.S. is a dominant power and should do everything to maintain that dominance, and as you referred to earlier, that feels like a backward-looking mindset or a mindset of the last century or two. Is it impossible for us to really make the adjustments in our policies given that mindset? Is that a bridge too far for us?
Well, it shouldn't be, because perversely some of the areas of competition, like say for oil and gas supplies with other rising powers like India and China, even ones like Brazil that you may normally not think of, who are rising in the manufacturing sectors, getting very thirsty for this resource, very competitive. Ironically and perversely, that competition is an effect of the system we built. And Americans tend to forget we built a globalized system purposely after World War II to avoid what were perceived as mistakes of the past. Hoarding of wealth, zero-sum behavior, what I have you don't have, and that makes me stronger. Elites, both Democrat and Republican, after World War II said that's what got us into 2 world wars. We're not going to repeat the mistakes of the Western Europeans. We're going to set up the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. We're going to create a new global economy based on free trade. Well, what has happened is that this has resulted in more and more of the world rising up, at least some of the countries, like the ones I've mentioned. And so they're thirsty for some of the same resources we've enjoyed at cheap prices. But rather than seeing this as a threat, you can flip it and say, well, since this is a consequence, naturally, of the system we created after World War II, these rising powers and their thirst for resources and so forth, well, isn't there a way to work with them to limit the negative externalities of that system we created and cooperate rather than compete on things like energy supplies?
Well, it's interesting that for many, the word power itself denotes zero sum, denotes there are winners and losers, and you're going to be on one end or the other. Better to try to be a winner and preempt others from doing so. Does it mean? I mean, does your sort of position mean that notion of power has changed? And maybe if you could talk a little bit about what makes a country a rising power.
Right. Well, I think power has and hasn't changed. As always, these things have a dual answer. First of all, there's one central way in which power has changed that does disadvantage the U.S. given where we've been putting our dollars and our budgets, and that is in what I call high-tech, heavy conventional military force or strategic weaponry. We're talking about tanks, F-22s, big strategic bombers. There are analysts, even at places like the Strategic Studies Institute of the Army War College, of all places, who has co-written a brief actually for us on our website, in the Stanley Foundation website, on the military we need rather than the one we have. Better, not bigger, I think is the title, where he says right in the brief, the probability of all-out interstate great power war is lower than at any time in history since great powers were created, and is so low that we shouldn't be putting our funding into that. What that means is, since we have been putting our funding into that very high-end version of military, we're automatically disadvantaged because, in a sense, we're wasting our money. But here's the flip side. There are actually, in addition to strong states, failing states around the world. We see this with Afghanistan. People are worried about Pakistan. You have examples like Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have all these ill effects: trafficking, illicit smuggling, massive human rights violations, and the indirect economic costs of the global economy are astonishing. Most people would be surprised. It's in the hundreds of millions or billions. And there, I think, is a possible solution. Again, if you flip it, the question is not, does the military matter anymore, but what kind of military power matters? And can the U.S., who is the best in the world at using military power right now, pursue types of military power that other nations, including other rising powers, actually see as useful, as opposed to, I would say, over the last 8 years, as us pursuing a sort of an aggressive zero-sum policy ourselves.
We have a couple minutes before the break, and I wonder if I could push you on some dimensions of that power. So economic power has been mentioned as the new military power, if you will, the new defining dimension by which nations will have power, be seen as having power, and be able to exercise power. So has that become the predominant form of power now?
Well, I think that's true. That you don't have a secure world without U.S. naval patrols. And I agree with realist scholars and others who say if you don't have U.S. naval patrols in every ocean of the world, you don't have stability in those regions. I think that is a basic foundational thing. I think the world does appreciate us for that very basic public good we provide. So Japan doesn't have to fear war with China because the U.S. Navy is there between both of them. But you get beyond that foundation, and absolutely, economic power in a globalized free market, free currency economy just matters like never before in terms of how much might, quote unquote, you actually have. Your ability to provide for your citizens, your ability to invent new things, to make something of them, matters more than the old variables like territory and status and prestige through military battles and so forth that used to matter so much. And there, I think a lot of Americans are concerned, and rightly so, but I would take it back again to our own policies and say, rather than focusing on China as a threat because they have all these scientists graduating from their schools and they're taking all our jobs, I think the question should be reframed as, well, what can we do in our own policies to be more like China in those areas where we envy their rising status?
Great. Mike Kraig, we're just up to our break. To our viewers, we'll be back in just a moment to continue our discussion about rising powers with Dr. Michael Kraig of the Stanley Foundation. See you in a moment.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about rising powers with Dr. Michael Kraig of the Stanley Foundation. Michael, I want to talk just a couple more dimensions of power before getting to the notion we've talked about a couple times around competition and cooperation and how we respond to that. What's the role, or how do you think of, or is there a place for, say, sort of, for want of a better word, cultural power, or different from that, say, legitimacy, based on sort of moral persuasion? Do we see those forms of softer power also at play here?
Absolutely, and this is why the world still, despite everything that you've heard international complaints about over at least the last 8 years, and there were certainly complaints globally about Clinton's policies as well in certain ways. Despite that, in fact, our culture is, our popular culture, that is predominant around the world. I've traveled to Asia, I've traveled to every capital of the Middle East in my work for the Stanley Foundation over the last 8 years, and I can say with confidence that our movies are everywhere, our comic books are everywhere, our lingo, our slang, our music, and even sort of our moral worldview permeates, and people take our values and mold them to their local religion or their local culture, but you're still talking about a mix where they really are taking from the American ethic or this American moral ideal. And I'm not talking about Catholicism or Protestantism, but more generally, I guess, and vaguely, everything that you can think of under the words American ideal, still very seriously felt throughout the world, co-opted by local peoples. But here's where the power ends, is that I think what the last 8 years have shown is if you try to go beyond what is happening organically, what I just described, and say it's not enough that you adopt our values or our worldview on capitalism or freedom, free media, etc., to your local culture. We want you to change to be more like us completely. I'm a fan of let them co-opt our culture and say that's enough of a moral victory or cultural victory right there. But yes, Americans, I think, very much underestimate how much that soft power exists. And I think when you had those thousands, was it tens or hundreds of thousands of people that turned out in Berlin to watch Obama speak, there's clear evidence right there. So again, we've talked about this idea of cooperation, competition. Again, with the zero-sum notion, it feels like competition, but if you're saying we're not necessarily in that zero-sum world anymore, we have these other dimensions of power, what types of cooperation, or what possibilities for cooperation does that open up? Well, first of all, we do have to be honest, sort of realistic about areas where we have lost power before you can see the opportunities, because there is a loss in the economic field. After World War II, the reason we were able to create global institutions en masse and define them and be the majority vote practically in all of them is because we held more than 50% of the world's GNP and GDP after World War II had devastated the entire world. We just filled this incredible vacuum. That historical moment is never going to return. In fact, it started to die away in the 60s and 70s with the onset of what's now called the Rust Belt, which is a term a lot of people are familiar with. We're not going to get that post-World War II moment. But then this leads you potentially to areas, niche areas of cooperation. For instance, energy technologies. China and India and others like them are so busy trying to catch up to us in living standards by the old methods that they're relying on coal and fossil fuels, and this is well known, that how polluting their industries are, just like England's and ours were 100 or 200 years ago. But we're beyond that stage now, which ought to be viewed as an opportunity for us to invent new energy technologies in cooperation perhaps with scientists around the world, but with us leading the effort, something Thomas Friedman has written in his book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. And I'm maybe an optimist, but I think even with us never regaining the post-World War II dominant global economic position, there'll always be a room for American ingenuity if we're funding education, if we're looking, our policymakers are looking for the areas of niche cooperation with others where it exists. And let's talk some about who are these risers. So who are the people that would fit into the category of rising powers? Maybe there's say even a first or second tier of sort of risers. But who do you see being the countries that are coming to the fore now? Well, it's a complex mix of demography, population, natural resources, as well as technological resources that are invented. There's also cultural power. Does your culture allow you to blend with globalization, take elements of globalization, bend them to your own uses? And I would list a wide array of powers that differ on these variables. On the large population, large potential economic growth, you have countries like Indonesia, and higher than that right now, Brazil and South Africa. Countries who have already made it in a lot of ways, South Korea, Japan, the EU, to some extent China, although India and China, it must be kept in mind, very much like Brazil, you're talking about some sectors being very wealthy, very forward-leaning, cosmopolitan, etc., and other parts still being dismally poor and without the technologies of the metropolitan centers. And so when we say the word rising powers, it's important to unpack it. In countries like India and China, Indonesia, you have the good, the bad, and the ugly across the board within those countries' borders. Areas of strong state control, weak state control, drugs, not drugs, etc. These are still very much evolving political and social systems that have a lot of their own problems. So when you hear the word rising power, you shouldn't think that, well, they've topped out on every variable and every level of influence. They're making great strides in some, still really struggling in others.
You mentioned at the top of the show about the dangers of looking back, and I think for some, rising power may harken back to, hey, they're like the United States in the 50s. Right. But that moment's gone for us, but I assume you're saying it's really gone for them too, because there's no one really in that position now.
Well, I think that, yes, you can't get a country with the hegemonic economic and military and cultural influence of the U.S. I won't say ever again, never say never, but just the circumstances were so unique that our greeting onto the world stage is suddenly this world power right after World War II, where every other great power in the world had literally destroyed themselves and in the process destroyed the global economy that they had structured before we came on the scene. And no, those circumstances aren't coming again. And so rising powers should be seen through the lens of what's called not a unipolar world, but a multipolar. What you're really saying is, will it become another unipolar world, only someone else but us? Right. And my answer is no. It's what we're entering into, or where we are already, is a multipolar world, and it's going to stay that way for the indefinite future.
And you've also, I know that the foundation has also talked about non-state rising powers. That one of the other dimensions of the current environment is it's not just states who qualify as powerful. Who are some of the other folks that are players now in this more complicated environment?
Well, there's the obvious multinational corporations, or MNCs for short, where I forget the statistic, but there are many countries that have smaller GNPs than Walmart's profits every year. For better or for worse, some view that with joy and some with fear and disdain. You have the think tanks and the nonprofits and the citizen activist groups, which in a lot of parts of the developing world are starting to lend political legitimacy to their own systems. Some places where globalization is proceeding apace without environmental controls, for instance, like in certain provinces of China or Thailand or other parts of Asia, these citizen groups are springing up, sometimes locking hands literally across borders and saying, governments, okay, listen up, the quality of life still matters, we're being disadvantaged. But then you have the really ugly side, which is a group like Al-Qaeda. And the question is, how can they be viewed as rising? And what I would really focus on is not a state like Iran, who I think can be deterred. I believe deterrence works. People who run states are not suicidal. But truly stateless groups, I think, can rise up in a very certain way, and that's if they get a hold of a certain amount of nuclear fissionable material and can make a very crude nuclear explosive device. These designs are on the web. The hard part is getting the right amount of fissile material, predominantly for the cruder bombs, highly enriched uranium specifically. But if they get it, you can imagine a completely and utterly non-state actor, not like Hamas, who gets aided by a state or is focused on a local conflict, but a global, highly ideologized, if you want to put it this way, very zealot-like group like Al-Qaeda with these global utopian views. No constraints on them, no way to deter them, no center of gravity. They don't reside in any one state. So one cell of this broad network gets a hold of this material, connects it to scientific expertise in another cell of that network. Someone else, some third cell comes together, puts together the bomb. Suddenly you have a suitcase bomb maybe that can go off in New York or Washington, D.C. And that's the way in which I fear terrorism. Is not every terrorist out there, not even the groups you hear like Hezbollah and Hamas in the news so much, but going back to 9/11, the original, the original transnational terrorists of 9/11, Al-Qaeda plus a nuclear weapon, I think that is a potential rising non-state actor that we should be very concerned about.
We've got just a couple minutes left before we need to wrap up. So I'm wondering if you were whispering in the ear of President Obama and saying, you know, the one or two things you need to keep your eye on are what? And I assume one of them is what you've just mentioned, Al-Qaeda, nuclear weapons, and so on. Are there other issues that you'd say we need to incorporate into our foreign policy?
Well, happily, he has incorporated very strongly preventing nuclear terrorism as something separate from competition with state actors like Iran, which is great because the Bush administration mushed them together and I think blurred the lines. Another thing is energy security in a very specific sense, and this is where I'll personally be looking very much for presidential leadership, is admitting not just that we need energy conservation in the existing energy system of fossil fuels, but looking ahead, knowing we're going to run out of them in 50 to 70 years. And the remaining 50 to 70 years are highly volatile as well. And saying, what can America do in the triangle of academia, government, and private corporations to invent a new energy system?
I think President Obama's going to have to take that for advice for now.
Yeah.
We need to wrap up.
Yeah.
Dr. Michael Kraig, thank you very much for lending your insights to rising powers and U.S. response. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.